few other things to mention as well. Please sort of show some respect for our speakers. So let's try and leave when the sort of question time is over. And I have a few other things to mention about the lightning talks. These are going to happen this evening, or sort of after the break. And there will be drinks after the lightning talks, so I hope that's a reason to stick around for them. Those of us who are doing the lightning talks and helping out, please stay in the room. So our final speaker for today is Ian, and he's going to talk about a topic that I'm really interested in because I don't have any skills on the front end side. So I'm really looking forward to this one. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Duggan. I live and work in San Francisco, and I'm here to talk to you about making SPAs without the SPA. So SPA would be single-page application. I'm very jet-lagged, so if I seem a little slow and laggy, please forgive me. So initially, this presentation, it started out as a simple demo of a technique that I've been playing with. But upon reflection, I think it's about more to me. It's about not accepting things for how they are, and that's not how progress happens. And that doesn't mean that you should tear down all institutions, but one can question dogma. So I've been doing that quite a lot in the last year or so. And for me, in this small moment, it had been some unhappiness I'd felt with web development. Going back 10 years or so, I tried to do the Rails way, and it was productive for a while, but the language and framework did not prevent many of the problems of larger projects. I tried MVC, I tried templates and controllers and views and such. And ultimately, it just wasn't satisfying. Something felt kind of off. And for me, it's friction. And friction really frustrates me. The kind of friction that I would feel a lot comes from like seeking out little snippets of code and templates in this directory or that directory. And that certainly seems to work for others, but I don't really like it. I can get by with it, but I don't like it. And I want to stay in code as much as possible, and in just one code, like bouncing back and forth between Ruby and HTML, Ruby and templates, or Elixir and templates. I just don't really like that. And I want to be able to think in functions and modules, and not in frameworks. And I want to be able to just use pattern matching and conditionals, and not have to escape into, cartoon swear words in ERB. I find that hard to type, pun intended. And for some reason, I just find it really cumbersome to have a separate application for the client. I mean, why can't I just stay in Elixir? Can't I just stay on the server? And why can't my UI just be a projection of my database? And the answer to all of these questions is yes, you actually can do this. And the pixels on the page are rendered relatively directly from the bits on the disk. So let's just do that and get on with it without some of these intervening layers. So to do so, you might have to invent the future that you want. So that's what this talk is about. It's about the efforts I've been taking to enable this style of development. I do not make any claims that anyone else should do this. If you like it, please use it. Help me make it better, but it's not perfect. But there are a lot of fun problems in here that still need to be solved. And may I also point out that this is a terrible idea, and I've created a monster, and I'm about to poison all of your brains, and for that, I'm sorry, not sorry. I encourage you all to keep scratching those itches, and that's where all these wonderful, exciting ideas come from, because God knows open source is not about getting paid. It's about fun and learning and discovery, and it's about inventing the future that you want to live in. So being grandiose, this is about category theory, this is reactive, this is Turing and Church and Curry and Howard and the oneness and equivalence of everything and many things that is computation. This is about functions and actors. This is about data and actions and mappings and UI. And this is how I paste it all together. Those ideas were part of my inspiration for this, and I hope it excites you as much as it excites me, because there's a lot of simplicity in all that complication. So on this journey, discovering Uncle Bob Martin was a breath of fresh air. as I mentioned, I felt uneasy about working in Rails in a way that I couldn't fathom at the time. My projects were organized, but they weren't. I spent a lot of time bouncing around in them when working on a feature. Why? Everything is where it's supposed to be, but if that's the case, why do I have these editor functions to bounce me around between related files, and why do they need this absurd regex to work properly? Something just didn't feel right. Around that time is when I found Uncle Bob's Screaming Architecture series, and if you haven't seen and read this, you should go look it up. It's very interesting. And yes, this is what I'd been missing. I was blinded by my framework. I wasn't thinking anymore. I had controllers and views and models, but I didn't have users and rooms and payments anymore. And that's where I was going wrong. I had wrapped the framework around my application instead of my application around the framework. Reading and learning more, it all made sense. And a similar concept is hexagonal architecture, or ports and adapters, and these again are all about separation of concerns. And looking back, it seems to me that Rails ruined a generation of programmers. Like, there was no doubting the value that it provided. It birthed billion-dollar unicorns, many of them, and MIT in me really wrestles with the New Jersey in me. I've only recently settled that mentally by understanding that the MIT New Jersey thing is an economic argument, not a technical one. Software is a virus. You can copy it, and it will grow very quickly, and businesses want things now more than they want good things. The value captured smooths and soothes the inevitable rough edges of the less curated approach. But I want to fix this if I can. I want to keep things simple, but not too simple, and I want to use the tools that the language provides to keep things organized. That's what they're there for. We can do most of this using modules and functions and libraries. We really don't need anything more. The CCC patterns are still in there, but we just won't be naming our directories that way. I encourage you to be suspicious of frameworks and abstractions, and to take only what you need. Now, let me be clear. I don't want anyone to take this as a criticism of Phoenix. I love it. I use it as the base for almost all of my projects. However, sometimes I think it does too much. Now, if you take a plug-based microframework like Trot and try to use that, you will quickly see all the great things that Phoenix does for you. So maybe we can find a middle ground from the parts that bug me. One thing that I don't like are these top-level directories for controllers, views, and templates. Those are implementation details to me. I mean, they're part of my application, but do I have to use them? I also don't like the libfoo and libfoo web directories. They feel kind of like umbrellas, but not. They feel kind of like applications, but not. I mean, I don't quite know what they are. And also, sometimes it's not clear to me where things should go. Like, where do I put plugs? They're just functions. They work for web requests, but they don't have to work for web requests. Do they go in web? Do they go in web? So just to stretch the brain a bit, what if it were like this instead? Gone are the various folders for controllers and views and templates. Those are not an architecture. Again, those are implementation details. I like this kind of layout because if I'm working on the dashboard, everything UI related is in one place, and I don't have to bounce around anymore. And so one might ask, could this be made to work? And it turns out it works just fine, which is a testament really to how well Phoenix is engineered and put together, that you can just chop it up and move things around, and they continue to work. You can just tell it in your definition, usually the foo web ex or whatever, to use a different root and namespace. I was actually stunned that this worked, and it took like 20 or 30 minutes of work one day. I saw a blog post that had done something similar and tried it out. I once tried this in Rails, and it was a disaster. So Phoenix is quite awesome. So the next thing I want to talk about are ERB templates. This is the next stop in the code of many colors that I put together, which is an HTML rendering library. I'm a terrible typer. I don't like the shift key, and the number keys are too far away from my fingers. I don't like moving my brain back and forth between Elixir and HTML, and Elixir and HTML. When I'm coding an application, it's easy for me to get hung up on things that cause friction. For me, personally, having to write templates is a pain. It's enough for me to want to stop working on something, check my email instead. And for someone who's prone to distraction, this is not good. I also find it awkward to have a crippled view language that isn't really crippled. I mean, I totally get the argument that the view language can be eval-less, forcing you to keep computation concerns separate from rendering concerns. And I fully support that approach, but I don't always want to use it. For me, there's not much point in having a view language in which I can escape into fully blown computation just by embedding a couple squigglies and an equal sign. Again, I get why many designers and developers like it. I just have a hard time typing the cartoon swear words because my fingers are fat and slow. So I set out to fix this somehow. I decided I would try to write a library where I could do it all in code and abandon templates altogether. So the design had two basic requirements: simple Elixir-based generation of tag-based markup, and I wanted it to interoperate properly with Phoenix helpers. I'd looked and tried a few similar libraries. There's one called EML, there's one called Marker, which I think they're by the same fellow. But I wasn't able to get either of them to work easily with Phoenix helpers, or I had some problems with their approach. Like they'd use the @tag syntax and templates, and it wasn't referring to a module attribute, so I just got confused. And my goal is to keep things simple. So my library is called taggart, and it lets you express things like HTML, XML, SGML using simple Elixir block syntax. Uses macros to do this, obviously, and it supports a number of different call styles. And it tries really hard to do the right thing. It can usually tell where you want the content to be. If you have something short and sweet, you can get by with a one-liner, or you can use block syntax. And you can nest and combine things in expected ways. You can set variables and use them simply. I mean, there's no more need for escaping. Macros are doing all the work. Now, since these are macros, they can be a bit surprising at times, so it's still best to keep your markup-ish code isolated into separate modules, but you should be doing that anyway. As I mentioned, I wanted it to work with Phoenix helpers, so it does. It just creates an IO list. It uses the IO list underlying representation, the same that Phoenix uses. And it actually uses that by using the Phoenix content tag. So these macros are just calling down into a Phoenix content tag. And since it produces IO lists, it should remain compatible with any other library that uses the same format. That's one of the issues I had with some of those other libraries, is they actually use strings. So it was hard to combine them together. And you can also embed Phoenix helpers into the taggart. This works just fine. And you could use it in place of templates, which was my goal. Phoenix templates, it turns out, are just functions that are compiled directly from the EEX files. So this makes it possible to pattern match directly in a view to render your pages. As you can see here, it's easy to break things into partials, but these are just functions. So it's really easy to have something big and then chop it up into smaller pieces. And you can stay in one file, and you don't have to bounce back and forth across all the other various files. And you can see here in the render body how easy it is to do simple looping, just calling another helper to render the list item. I mean, it's fancy, but it's also simple, and I like this a lot. I was worried that performance would be an issue. EEX certainly has an advantage in that it is precompiled, but I was pleasantly surprised. Performance-wise, it's decent. It could be better. With Elixir, we're already getting microsecond level template rendering, and taggart is 3 times slower, but that's still microseconds. For me, this is still a win. I'm using it for things like dashboards where rendering performance is not the primary concern. And again, we're talking about microseconds here, so it hasn't mattered yet. And as I mentioned, currently it uses macro expansion to make calls down into the underlying content tag helper. And as such, the bulk of the work is spent making calls to and from this function. I have ideas for improving the performance by doing ahead of time compilation, so you could just take the tag and have it write out EEX files during the compilation phase and just dip into all the optimized code that's already written there. Let's see. So the code is up on GitHub. It's still a new project. I expect issues to crop up here and there with the API and performance, et cetera. So please provide feedback in our reports. There's documentation there, and I hope you find it useful. As an afterthought, after I made this project, I discovered a very similar one called WebAssembly, which will soon be a very poor name. But I might not have created taggart had I seen that one first, and I looked for a long time. So I think Elixir needs a better discovery mechanism for this kind of stuff. It could be that this project is well named. WebAssembly is a totally different thing. OK, so now I can make HTML quickly, and it's painless now. I don't need templates, but I do need widgets. I'm not that good with HTML or CSS, and I can get by with Stack Overflow and slow, steady progress. However, the multitude of tools and frameworks out there for the front end is quite mind-numbing. I also found it frustrating that many of the CSS frameworks brought a lot of their own JavaScript along, which made them difficult to integrate with backend frameworks. If you want CSS Framework A with React, you might need to get CSS Framework A for React, which was a fork of CSS Framework A. And this pattern was everywhere, and that felt like a code smell to me. So I was looking for one that didn't rely on lots of JavaScript, and I searched and searched and finally came across UIKit. To me, UIKit is remarkable because it is designed around the idea that something else might change the DOM, so even the JavaScript components it has work well in this world. Like from their documentation, Kit is listening for DOM manipulations and automatically initializes, connects, and disconnects the components as they are inserted or removed from the DOM. That way it can be easily used with JavaScript frameworks like Vue and React. So this sounded promising. And it has lots of cool widgets, so this will be helpful. Lots. 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 And for someone who can't do front end well, this looked great. So I started playing around with it. But the markup can be quite complicated. The project is very featureful, so it has all of these different classes that you can add and combine in various ways to make it do what you want. For Flexbox, for example, you will have to create a div and add flex, and then add flex center medium if you want it centered on medium, and flex right large if you want it on the right on a large one. And if you leave off the UK flex at the front, it won't work. So I thought this could be made easier, especially with taggart. All these, so I created a library for this, and all these various rules are baked into the library, and the call style is very consistent, so I find it a lot easier to work with. Everything on these, it's kind of hard to see for me. So everything on these various pages here is rendered using a library, this taggart that I put. So you can see it works pretty well. And the code ends up being a lot easier. Let me see. What was I going to show you? Don't remember. So that project's not quite done yet. I'm still fighting with some of the macro stuff. And I can't tell if what I'm doing is brilliant or abusive, but I think that's how macros are supposed to feel. And I need to spend some time trying to simplify that part. There are also some significant refactorings that I am planning, but the demos work and the API is fairly stable. You're welcome to check it out, but again, it's not quite done yet. So that was fun. I learned a lot about macros, but that's not nearly enough to be proficient with them. But now I want my pages to move. I want the heralded single-page apps. But I don't really want to do this with JavaScript. So what do I do? Yeah, I spent years messing around with typical front-end stuff, jQuery, Ember, Angular, React, Ohm and ClojureScript for a little while. They get the job done, but again, there's that friction. There's a whole other build system, a whole other language, a whole other set of views and models and callbacks and such. It works, but it's not simple. So I asked myself, can we simplify this? Can I just get rid of the whole client side? Like maybe there's something tricky we can do. So the first stop on my server-only train was a project called Drab. This is a really cool-looking project, and I was totally psyched to use it. It has a client-server sort of model where you label things in the UI and you can poke data into the spots from the server-side code. This looked very promising, so I pulled it down and rolled up my sleeves and tried to use it. But unfortunately, the project works by processing your EEX files, transforming them, and compiling drab-enabled templates for use by Phoenix. I tried to figure out how to make this work with taggart, but it was just going to be too hard. And I was happy using my templateless approach now, and I didn't want to go back to having to use templates again. And again, there was something about the client-server poke model that didn't feel right. This felt very stateful, and I wanted something more reactive. I want my UI to be a projection of the data, not an imperative command from the back end. So I kept looking around. I found a project called unpoly.js, which is also very cool. This is a simple JavaScript library that you put on in the browser, and it works by sort of like turbolinks. It replaces fragments on the page, so you end up with something that feels very SPA-like, and the transitions are very smooth, and so it feels like a client application again. Let me just. So it allows you to build stuff like this. So what this is doing is actually, these are server-rendered pages, and it is noticing which part of the page has changed and just kind of swapping it in. So it's a different mental model, but you can spend time thinking about how you want your pages to work and just kind of put this together. So this looked promising. It has modes and all sorts of sort of helpers that you can use to make it do various things. So it has pop-ups, animation, forms, tooltips, layouts, events, lots of stuff. As I mentioned, it works sort of like turbolinks. You decorate your HTML with indicators that tell it how to graft in server responses. So you could do many things with unpoly, but like I said, it felt like the mental model was going to be too different from any problems. And it seemed more like it was for dressing up static sites, not for building a full-blown reactive app, which was my goal. So what I wanted was the feel and data model mostly of something like React, and I wanted my views to be a production of the data. I wanted the simplicity of Elm's model update view functions, and I want to do this completely in Elixir with minimal JavaScript. So you have model, update, and view. You have state, message, and response. It sounds an awful lot like a gen server. We have channels. We have this unpoly thing. So what if I took gen servers, connected them with channels, and had DOM events come in over the channels, and sent views back over the channels to unpoly and have it render them? Could this work? It turns out it does work. Now it looks something like this. Gem server keeps the state for the user. It's all on the server. For a single component root, there's one gen server that comes to life when it gets a message. It receives DOM events from the browser, and it updates the state and sends UI updates right back over. The gen servers are managed by a dynamic supervisor. This is a really cool new feature of Elixir. It was really easy to use. The components are scoped to a visitor ID, which is unique to each browser. There's a limitation right now where only one large component can be used, but this works well for the things I've used it for, but that will be improved. The plan is to further scope on-page components with named identifiers, but I'm still working on this. So setup on the client side is pretty easy. I copied the way that Phoenix builds and installs the phoenix.js client. I got stuck for a second trying to figure out, okay, I'm going to need a little bit of JavaScript. Do I have to make a separate NPM? How does this work? It turns out you can just reference it directly from the files that Mix installs. So I noticed Phoenix was doing this, so I copied what they were doing. I stole it. I noticed in this process that Phoenix was moving to Webpack. That was news to me. So you just put a reference to your library in your package.json. You import Presto and unpoly from your app.js. UI upper channel to carry all these events. And then you reference your component from a layout or an index HTML file. So I have a component called presto root, which I'll show you in a second, and I'm passing in a visitor ID, which is set up through a plug. Now, using one of these components, it's like a gem server. You just use presto page. You add an initial model. So the example I'm showing here is just a basic counter on a page. It has an increment button, a decrement button. So we start with a model of 0. You define an update function. So it takes a message from the DOM and a model, and it returns a new model, or the old model if nothing should change. There's some wrapper code which manages the other parts of the state for you, so all you need to worry about is the state for your specific little component. And the third method you need to implement is render. So here, the value of a counter and some buttons to increment and decrement. The class here, presto click, is how click event gets attached and sent over. This happens for you. It's handled in the client that I mentioned. So all the various DOM events are available. So you can use mouse move, and that actually works pretty well. Let me show you a quick demo of it real quick. So this one I have running over. Oops. That's my cat. Make that bigger. So this one's running on my machine. So that's doing what I described. Like there's a channel set up and it's going back and forth, and updating the state, etc. I will show you the code in a second, but let me see. So when I first tried this idea, I thought there's no way this could work. I mean, you're sending DOM events across a channel, and aren't there lots of those? For many apps, it turns out that works out fine. We have these lovely microsecond level responses from Phoenix, and the internet is pretty fast in lots of places. And humans just need things to be 100 milliseconds or so to feel immediacy. So I thought I'd give it a try, and I was actually very surprised that it worked, or how well it worked. So I have 2 examples here. Let's see. So this one is running in Frankfurt. It's a AWS US Central 1 or whatever I think it is, or EU Central 1. So this app is put together using this project. And click, click, click. So it's pretty usable. Big HTML taggart. And see, I can type here. So that's me typing. I've got a little race condition in this one I'm trying to figure out because I've embedded a JavaScript editor and they're fighting over the events. So those are some of the problems that are still going to crop up that I'm sorting out, but as you can see, this works decently. So this is in Frankfurt. I have another one here, which is running on the west coast of the United States, in US West 2. And so this is the test. Click, click, click. And I can do some typing. Oh, there's my little race condition. But so it's actually pretty responsive. I was honestly stunned. And this approach works really well with Electron, especially since everything is on the server. I mean, it's ungodly, but yes, it works. So let's give that a go. Which one of these guys is Electron? So this is the same app running on my machine, but this is running in Electron. So if you want to build Phoenix apps, or if you want to use Phoenix to build Electron apps, you can do it. Let's just make them all bigger and bigger and bigger. Let's see. Oops, play. If you want to make it work with Brunch and Electron, it turns out there's a conflict with module loading. They both define and require as different things. So there's a quick little hack you need to do. There's something that replaces require with my require. So if you go try to do this tonight, you'll need this. And with this approach, testing is easy. It's just a gen server. So you spin it up, you update it, and you test the response, and you're done. Growing your app is very simple. If your render method gets too big, you split it up into helpers and modules and whatnot. If your update method gets too big, you split it up into helpers and modules and whatnot. So you just use the language. There are still problems to be solved. I'm working on push messages from the server, so you can have a timer that's updating, for example. I'm going to do the to-do MVC example. I plan on messing around with lenses and optics to see if those will work well for embedded components. I think a protocol-based method dispatch on embedded state types will work out nicely, so I'm looking forward to trying that. And of course, there will be a time-traveling debugger. So the code is up here, and it's available. There's Presto, which is the name of the library that I put together. There's a small demo app, which is quite messy. I wouldn't look at that one yet. And there's Presto Change, which has the code for the more featureful thing I put there. That one, if you go and look in the code, I tried out this library, Witchcraft, which does monads. I wasn't looking for monads. I just wanted ADTs, because it turns out if you just have like an enum that you want to represent, I thought that would be helpful. So I tried it out. So that's in that code if you go take a look at it. So I'm going to keep hacking on this, and I hope you'll join me. That's what I have. So I can spend some more time showing you the code, or if you have questions, I could answer them. He's got one.
Hey, thanks for mentioning Drab. I'm the guy who wrote it.
Oh, great.
So I would like to just to tell you that you don't have to use the EX engine, Drab's EX engine to work with Drab. It's just one of the alternatives. You can directly push the changes to the page with a CSS selectors.
Okay.
That's a library which is called drab.element.
Can we meet up later and you show me how that works?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. That would be awesome.
Cool.
I really did try very hard to make it work, and I got stuck.
I guess this is what these conferences are about.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the more sophisticated example. So this is the Presto Changeo that I put together. So I've got a separate. So for this one, I moved the state into this other module called converter. So I just create a new one. As these clicks come in, each of those buttons is labeled with an ID, and I just call update input on the model. So I'm delegating the update to this model. That's an example of how you could kind of split stuff out. And the editor stuff down in here, and then the render here shows an example of breaking things up into helpers. So this is making use of taggart, and this is using UIKit, but this is before I'd written the library, so this is just using it directly. But that page, if you remember, it had controls at the top, it had a workspace, and I had the helper buttons at the bottom, so I just have it split up into 3. It's a div with controls, workers, helpers. Each of those takes a model and just builds out what it needs. So as you're making your view, you don't have to think about the state. You just have the current state. You draw the view. You let it update, and then you draw the view. You let it update, you draw the view. And it takes, the library does all the work of doing a diff and just applying the updates for you. So Unpoly's doing all that work. I didn't invent anything there. But.
Hi. Have you thought about doing this at a slightly different level, so you could use React or something and do the state management on the server?
Yeah, yes. I've thought about different ways of doing it. This was the simplest thing to get working that I understood how to do so far. I have some crazy notion that when ElixirScript comes further along, you could take this idea of the projection and have this code created for you somehow and pushed out to the browser, so that you don't need to rely on Unpoly as much, and maybe you can get direct access to the DOM. for me, a lot of it started from like not wanting to have to spend so much time thinking about the fact that there's a network in between. I mean, you need to, because like there are issues there, so you can't assume that there's no network. But I wanted the library to do more work to help you there. So like I was trying to find ways where it wasn't a client and a server. Like I could blur that line by projecting one into the other. So I started with this. I just say, pretend there's no network. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, that sounds like really sophisticated stuff and very cool, and I'd love to explore it someday, but I'm definitely not there yet. All right, thank you.
Right.